Hi, beautiful humans. I am still working on my dress. I thought it would go together quickly, but then I forgot. I need to structure it a little bit because I am a bit larger and I need some extra support. So I figured it was about high time I showed you guys an actual pad stitching tutorial rather than just clips of me doing it in some sewing vlogs. Are you ready to do a little pad stitching and see the difference it makes between some limp linen and adding just a little bit of wool padding for 16th century clothing? Let's go. When I'm pad stitching 16th century garments, I usually do it into an interlining. I'll use a medium to heavy weight linen to do that. This is actually a heavy linen curtain I'm upcycling, since my goal is actually to make this entire Loki project an upcycling project. I need to cut out all of my shapes inside that linen. Because this one's a little bit more towards medium weight, I'm going to go ahead and include my seam allowance just to make it a bit easier for me to get this into the final garment. There are other times when it's more appropriate to use a muslin or a thin cotton, like what my mock-up's made out of, to pad stitch onto instead of a heavy linen. Usually that's if you're including your full seam allowance or if you're using a linen to stiffen rather than wool felt like what I'm using. I needed a little bit more body and a little more shaping with this dress, so I decided that heavy linen and some wool felt would do the trick. Keep in mind that you do not want any of this wool felt padding into any of your seam allowances. It will make it incredibly bulky and make the seam start to puff up in weird ways. That's why we're pad stitching this down onto a ground fabric. I will always try to go through and wax my linen threads or my cotton, whatever I happen to be using. Honestly, I think this one's probably just a random polyester that's almost out in my stash. Now that we've got all this prep work done, let's get to pad stitching, no? So to get started, let's think about what is a pad stitch. A pad stitch is basically a diagonal basting stitch. I always think of it as if I was whip stitching into a single layer of fabric, and it kind of does a corkscrew pattern for me in my head when I'm trying to figure out how to make my hands and needle move. The big thing about diagonal pad stitches, though, is that they're meant to be temporary. You're going to take those out. Whereas pad stitching is going to be a more permanent part of any of your garments that you're making. Your pad stitching, you may need to make it smaller or tighter depending on what you're doing with that particular set of shaping. This first row that I did, I used as more of a diagonal basting stitch, kind of flat, and I was really just trying to get the edge of my wool felt to tack down onto the ground fabric. And then I can start shaping the rest of this garment over my fingers going forward. You don't actually have to keep tying knots in these threads as you keep going. I usually just overcast the tails of my previous line and my new line into my stitches. That way they get secured and I can keep going a little more quickly and not have to create extra bulk and take the extra time to make knots. Keep in mind, if you're doing large long stitches, it's not going to build tension into the garment, which is really what you're trying to do when you're pad stitching. It's a tailoring technique that you use to create shape. It almost makes your sewing sculptural, which is why it's so commonly used today in collars and lapels, things that we want to hold a specific shape. The goal of the pad stitching in this bodice is actually to have it wrap around me a little bit more snugly. and to taper a little bit up towards the bust and suck in a bit towards the waist. It's almost like the proto shaping ideas that you would have for a corset or stays. So because of that, I don't need to do any interesting diagonals or anything like that right now. My garment is actually just going to have straight up and down rows, maybe with a little bit of shaping around my shoulders, but it's all going to be the same basic idea. If you were trying to do something with a little more shaping, I do recommend trying to run a normal running stitch style basting line to differentiate where you want your patterns to curve or to start going straight. It really just helps with the visuals. As you keep adding more and more rows to your pad stitching, you're going to start to notice that it creates this characteristic V shape or something that looks like crow's feet. I've always found that actually going through and making this pattern helps to stabilize the stitches and the layers of fabric together just a bit more than if you were to try and just do rows and rows of diagonals going the same exact direction. So something to keep in mind in case you're debating if you want to vary off of that traditional look. Out of respect for the actual professional tailors out there in the world, I'm just going to throw out there that I'm not. I'm at best an amateur. But if you're enjoying this basic tour through this, definitely click that like button so that I know what topics you all want me to cover over here. In addition to that, in the description I am going to put the information for a couple of really good tailoring manuals that you can go and review for more techniques, tips, and other bits that might help to up your sewing game. As we keep sewing, you're going to start to see little stitches on the back. My pad stitches for this are honestly really big, and I'm letting it have a lot of running thread on the back side of the linen because I'm trying to anchor an interlining. If you were doing this into an actual outer layer of fabric, you would want to make sure that those little pick stitches on the back side stay incredibly small. That way you're not seeing a whole bunch of thread back there. You might see a couple little picks that look almost like seeds on a strawberry instead of long floating stitches. So I guess my question of the week this week is, have you ever tried pad stitching for a garment? Whether it's a modern suit jacket or for more of a historical garment, definitely let me know about it in the comments. One of the goals of pad stitching is to put that tension in, but just watching myself on this video, I do want to remind you to make sure that you're not pulling it so tight that it starts to pucker. If you're having fabric pucker rather than it just naturally starting to roll under that finger, and you'll start to feel the difference if you play with this on a swatch. It's going to start to distort your garment in some weird ways over time. If it's something you're intending to do and it's a sculptural thing, go ahead, try it, but I would caution you against pulling it too tight and almost creating sausage rolls unless you really know exactly what that's going to do with your garment. In the 16th and 17th centuries, we start to see padding styles like this being used more frequently. We also have several doublets that have survived from the period that have been pad stitched. You might be using wool like I'm currently using, felted up, or maybe just a lighter sort of flannel type of wool, depending on the exact style and everything you're going for. And there are some examples that have even used cotton, as in the plant fiber. There is some debate about cotton being named in English, at least, after the fluffy bits that you would get off of sheep. and whether or not different inventories mean different things. While we didn't have a lot of experience with trying to spin this into fabric yet, we were able to use it for wadding like this. I just have a preference for the wool because it does breathe and act a little bit more like hair. So I found that I'm a little more comfortable when I use a wool felting. It doesn't even take many rows of pad stitching for you to get the sculptural results that you're looking at and start to see some progress in the shape of your garments. I hope this tutorial has been super helpful to you and that you let me know about any of your future pad stitching endeavors. Have a wonderful day and I'll see you in the next video. Bye everyone.